Thank you very much, Susie. For the past 28 years, it's been a tradition of our community to present an open forum and meet the candidates forum. And for the past 28 years, it's been our tradition to also ask the community for their support of our political candidates, whether they're Republicans, Independents, or Democrats. You search within your own hearts, your own soul, and whatever you are, to provide your support for these candidates because you do make a difference. Campaigns are a very, very expensive proposition, and they will become more expensive as time goes on. So our request to you in our community is, if you cannot give funds, then give a little bit of your time. If you can get involved in a campaign, you can make a difference in what that candidate will do when that candidate becomes elected. Consequently, I'm going to ask you to give of your time to your candidates. I'm going to ask you, if you can, to give of your funds to the candidates. And I know you'll all give a check of at least $10,000 or more to each campaign. Is that right? If you did, I don't think we'd have any worry about who the candidates would support. In any event, let me please make an announcement that Tim Carpenter, who is the campaign manager for the North campaign, I believe he's in the back of the room, he will be accepting funds for the North campaign. Kathy Adams, who is also in the back of the room, will be accepting funds for the Robb campaign. And Greg Gooddale, who is also in the back of the room, will be accepting funds for the Coleman campaign. So reach into your pockets, reach into your hearts. Please support the candidate of your choice, and let's have a great political year. Thank you very much.
Now I'd like to introduce to you the president of the Jewish Community Council, Peter Krauser, who will be our moderator this morning for the program. Peter?
Good morning. On behalf of the Jewish Community Council of Greater Washington, I'd like to welcome all of you here. It is thrilling to see the kind of turnout that we have here in such a vibrant community as Northern Virginia. The Jewish Community Council is the umbrella organization for over 220 different Jewish organizations and synagogues in the Washington metropolitan area. It covers everything from District of Columbia to Northern Virginia to suburban Maryland. We hope that you will find this political forum edifying, illuminating, and most of all, that you'll carry away with it some information that you can use in November when you cast your ballot. The format of this political forum has been chosen in consultation with the political candidates. It is to begin with each candidate, and the candidates are, of course, Colonel Oliver North, Marshall Coleman, and Senator Charles Robb. Each will be given 5 to 10 minutes on opening statements. Our timekeeper is Bob Goldberg from Bethel Hebrew Congregation. He will indicate to the candidate when he has a minute left, 30 seconds left, and when his time is over. And then I will try to gently advise them that their time is up. The 5 to 10 minutes, after the 5 to 10 minutes is over with, there'll be 15 to 20 minutes for questions. These questions will be taken from the audience. We have prepared some questions from the council and from the other organizations to ensure that some of the same questions are asked each of the candidates. But by and large, the questions will come from the audience. Now, these questions will be obtained by passing among you the 3x5 index cards, which we hope all of you have by this time. During my remarks, which are not worth noting necessarily, please fill out your cards. And also during the candidate speeches, which of course are worth noting, if there is an issue that pricks your attention or your mind, please fill out a question, and the questions will then be taken up to our table over here. The questions will be culled, and from those questions, we hope quite a few, at least a half a dozen, depending upon the length of the candidate's answers, will be asked to the candidate. At the conclusion of the 15 to 20 minutes, each candidate will be given 3 to 5 minutes to conclude. Once again, in the opening address, there are no restrictions, or on the closing address. The remarks and the issues that are addressed by the candidates are of their choosing. I would like to begin by introducing our first candidate, Colonel Oliver North. Colonel North. Colonel North is a former Marine, a Vietnam veteran. He has served with the National Security Council. He is presently chairman and founder of Guardian Technologies International. It is our great pleasure to introduce for you Colonel Oliver North.
Thank you. I want to thank all of you for being here this morning and for this chance to have the issues discussed in a forum that allows you to benefit from it as much as the media that's here. I would like to clarify just one thing. When Bob Goldberg was up here, he said you could give a check for $10,000. All of us will be in trouble if you do. The maximum contribution is $1,000. Second, I would like to go back to a point made by Rabbi Fink when he was here, because I believe that the issue of government power is what is on the table for this year's election process. It is a matter of what role the government will play in our lives, how intrusive it will be, what the cost of it will be for each of us, for our children and their children. It is, I think, interesting to note that 37 years ago this week, the Soviet Union launched the first man-made satellite to orbit the Earth, Sputnik. That launch gave rise to a government program that allowed us 12 years later to be the first nation to put a man on the moon. It was a government program that expended enormous resources, but had a finite purpose to it and a very definite set of goals and objectives. That program succeeded in accomplishing its objectives. It is also interesting to note that 30 years ago this month, we began an experiment in this nation, broadly labeled the Great Society Program, that was designed to make life better for those who had less in our society. Those programs invested enormous resources in public housing, welfare programs, and the like. Those programs have not succeeded, for by every measure we see in our society, all kinds of indicators that those programs have failed. There has been, over that 30-year period, a 560% increase in violent crime, a more than 400% increase in illegitimate births, a quadrupling of the divorce rate, a tripling of the percentage of children living in single-parent homes, a 200% increase in teen suicide, and a drop of 80 points in our scholastic aptitude test scores. By every indicator, those programs, which now cost us a national treasure, have not succeeded. At the same time, we live with an administration that campaigned on the premise that it would cut defense by about $60 billion below its previous administration's targets. That defense cut, in fact, was more than twice as deep as was promised. It is a defense cut that has literally left us unable to protect our vital interests in key areas of the world, and leaves allies of the United States, such as Israel, questioning the magnitude and the reality of our commitments. When Rabbi Fink spoke of the power of government, I would submit to you that the role of government is clearly defined in the preamble to our Constitution. That one of the things we need to be about in government is ensuring that at the very least we can fulfill those commitments, among them providing for the common defense. That would mean that we have to be able to meet our commitments overseas. It would also mean that we would have to do something different than what we are doing, particularly given the events of the last 48 hours, in which Iraq is now moving troops along the same border it crossed several years ago. I would submit to you that this administration, in advancing proposals that would turn back the clock to the Lyndon Johnson era, of even greater social spending, of reinvesting in programs that we acknowledge have failed, will not succeed in making society better. I do not pretend to have all of the answers, but I do know what works and what doesn't, and what we are doing today does not work. I would ask you to ask yourselves in this election if the records of those who are currently in office were so good, would our streets not be safer? Would our schools not teach better? Would our nation not be better defended? Would we not have a reduced debt and lower taxes? For indeed, the answers to those questions ought to be part of what drives us as a nation to vote for our elected leaders. I personally believe that the power in Washington to raise monies and spend monies, to increase taxes, to make the burden our children have to carry like a millstone around their necks while they're sent out to swim in a rising tide of red ink needs to be reduced. I believe that the programs that we have today in Washington, D.C., driven by a cast of professional politicians and the Clinton administration, are wrong-headed and taking this nation in a direction from which it will be more and more difficult for us to prosper. I would also point out that in this administration, we have seen an effort to polarize people who ought to be, at the very least, cooperating with one another. I have seen the term religious right used excessively over the course of the last 2 years. In the last 20 months, there seems to be an effort to distract people from the issues that I just articulated, that is, the role of government and its cost, and focus on polarizing issues that would distract us from the realities of what's going on. I do not believe that we ought to have in this nation, particularly in this state, the first of the American colonies to have a religious tolerance statute. Those who would wish to impose their religious perspectives on anyone. But I do believe we ought to encourage people to participate in their religious heritage, for that is what has made us one of the greatest nations on earth. The fact that this nation today sees in its political process advantage in trying to polarize people along religious lines defies the 200 years of history of this nation that has made us the most diverse and productive population on the planet. I would suggest to you that in Bill Bennett's most recent book, the one that blew my second book right off the bestseller list, that Bill Bennett listed 10 virtues that are important to our society. Among them, self-discipline, compassion, responsibility, friendship, hard work, courage, perseverance, honesty, loyalty, and faith. That those virtues, as Bennett called them, are important to our society. They are important in a society that was founded on very strong Judeo-Christian principles. That does not mean that they should exclude those of an Islamic faith or Buddhist or any other faith on this planet. For each of those religions endorse those virtues as well, though they might emphasize one greater than another or might have more beyond it. But I would submit to you that religious bigotry in this campaign ought not to occur, that we have no room for it in our political process in this nation, and that what we must be about as candidates and those who would espouse a various political cause ought to be to encourage people to participate in those virtues, to exercise their own religious heritage or lack of it, and certainly not to hesitate to invoke their own faith, though we would not want any of us to impose our values. For if this nation does not embrace those virtues, our employees, our customers, and our society will not be prosperous. What we ought to be about is encouraging, not discouraging. What we ought to be about is unifying rather than dividing. I believe that this campaign can do that, but it will not do that if people are intolerant of others' faith. It will not do that if people focus only on the negatives, and it will not do that if the people do not have a chance to discuss the issues. Thank you. I'd be pleased to take your questions.
If I just may take one point of order here, I'd just like to quickly introduce our panel who is collecting and culling the questions. Eugene Margolis from B'nai B'rith, Professor Travis from George Mason University, and Mary Tenenbaum, Director of the Jewish Community Council. Colonel North, you have stated that you support tax cuts, defense spending, increases, and a balanced budget. In addition, you have said you would not reduce Social Security benefits. What programs specifically would you cut to balance the budget?
Well, we can start with the congressional pay raise that Chuck Robb voted for himself. It strikes me that what you've got to be about... It strikes me that what you've got to be about in Washington is a whole new mindset as to what it is you want to accomplish. If you believe that increased federal spending on the programs I articulated in my prepared remarks are going to leave us with a better society, and you believe that higher taxes are the way to solve that problem, then I clearly am not your candidate. But if you believe that we're giving more than we ought to, that we're punishing success, removing capital from the private sector, and denying people the opportunity for a good job based on a private sector entrepreneurial experience, then I would submit to you that we've got to change the way in which we do business. And I have laid out a 54-point plan that would articulate a change of process in Washington, D.C. I believe we're going to see that in the new Republican majority in the United States Senate. It's a new reality. That new reality is going to focus on the kinds of changes in the tax law that allow increased revenues but lower taxes. And that happens with increased taxpayers. It allows that we're going to have to change the process by which we make our social expenditures. I don't believe that we ought to be attacking those who have invested, those vested entitlements that we have today. But it makes no sense to me that the federal government would be out buying more land at a point in time when it doesn't know how to pay our debts. It makes no sense to me that the legislators in Washington would vote themselves a $23,000 pay raise at the same time they're taxing those who earn more than $22,000 on retirement. So their Social Security tax is going to go up, having already been taxed on it once. It makes no sense to me that the federal government wants to spend $6 to $7 billion in social programs in a so-called crime bill, simply because it puts money out there on the street as a solution to the problem of crime. What I believe we've got to do is create more jobs, create more taxpayers, not raise taxes. That we've got to cut federal expenditures. You've got a blue ribbon panel right now looking at the entitlement programs, and what I'm saying is that the vested entitlement programs have got to be maintained. They cannot be cut, but those that are not vested programs are the ones that need to be reduced. Aid to illegal immigrants that come to this country doesn't make sense to me, and it's that kind of a mindset for a balanced budget amendment, a line item veto, and term limits that will give us some kind of control over the fiscal Titanic that our children are being sent out to sea on.
Thank you, Colonel. This is a particularly timely question in light of what we read in the newspaper this morning. What type of foreign policy do you believe the United States should adopt in a post-Cold War area? And more specifically, under what circumstances and in what form do you believe the United States should use military power as a tool of foreign policy?
Well, the United States, first of all, our foreign policy ought to be based on keeping commitments. We have commitments to various countries around the world that cannot be fulfilled today. The strategic agreement that was worked out with Israel in the 1980s is at risk today because this administration has cut defense to the bone. In fact, we today have a hollow military. The saber rattling that is going on in the Persian Gulf puts at risk the lights, the gasoline that we put in our cars, the heat in our homes, the industry of this nation. If the Korean situation happens to get worse at the same time, we will find just how hollow our military is today. I believe that our foreign policy today is being driven by inexperience, by ineffectiveness, and the Clinton administration's unwillingness to face the realities that they have cut defense far too deeply and to enable us to fulfill the commitments that we've made. I'm deeply concerned that if we end up with another situation like we had several years ago in the Persian Gulf, that we could not repeat Desert Storm. We would not be able to fulfill our commitments to our neighbors, to our friends, to those with whom we've made alliances. And I think we all ought to be very concerned that this administration has, since its very first days in office, waded neck deep in crisis, literally from Somalia, where he made the decision to go to Haiti the very day we withdrew the last Americans from Somalia. What did the 18 soldiers who died in Somalia die for? What are we doing in Haiti? What is it that we would have our American forces do to protect the commitments we've made to Israel? If the results of forcing Israel to make concessions to Syria would mean 35 to 40,000 Americans, 35 to 40,000 Americans on the Golan Heights, where would they come from given what this administration has done?
Thank you, Colonel. While we're on the subject of foreign policy, this is a multi-part question. What is your position with respect to the Middle East peace process and to foreign aid? Will you vote for the final passage of FY96 Foreign Aid Conference report? And what is your position with respect to the status of Jerusalem?
Well, I want everybody to please take the time to pick up off the table the handout that says where I stand, because it lays out all of those issues, I think, very clearly. First of all, the 96 FY96 foreign aid appropriation for Israel at about $3 billion is appropriate, and I would vote for it. Number two, I do not believe that we can be in the process of continuing to support those nations that vote against us 75% of the time in the United Nations. And my friend Trent Lott introduced a measure last year that would eliminate that kind of foreign aid for those kinds of countries. It went down to defeat on a straight party line vote. That won't happen with a new Republican majority. And I'm looking forward to working with people to make sure that that happens. Did I get both your questions?
Colonel, I believe the question of Jerusalem.
Question on Jerusalem. I laid out my belief that Jerusalem needs to be maintained as an integral city. It cannot be divided up as some in the United Nations have proposed. It cannot become a city that is cut into quadrants or thirds for some kind of international supervision, as some have suggested. Israel has obviously moved its capital back to Jerusalem. The United States continues to maintain its embassy in Tel Aviv. I believe that as long as these talks are proceeding, the consequence of the Madrid initiative that began in the Bush administration, we should not be making decisions to move our capital until those talks by the parties on the ground have resolved what they're going to do. And I don't think that the United States intervening in one side or the other is going to be helpful to that process at this time. What we need to be is honest brokers and make sure that the monitoring of the compliance of those accords is indeed what was agreed to by the parties on the ground.
Thank you, Colonel. The next question is, what is your position with respect to a woman's right to choose? And do you believe your position reflects the position held by the majority of Virginians?
Well, my position on the woman's right to choose is that I am opposed to public funding for abortion, and I will vote against it on every occasion. Number two, I am a person that believes a parent ought to have the right to counsel their youngster on that issue. Now, I happen to be the only pro-life candidate in this race, and I'm not ashamed of that. I well recognize that there are good people on both sides of that issue. But I've taken a very straightforward, firm stand that with the exception of life of the mother, rape and incest, there ought not to be public funding for abortions in this country. And there ought to be a chance for a parent to counsel their children on such a procedure. I think that's appropriate in a society where a school nurse has to pick up the phone and get a parent's permission to give an aspirin to a child at school.
Thank you, Colonel. One of the issues that's going to be hotly debated in the months ahead is welfare reform. Both liberals and conservatives alike have increasingly recognized that various welfare programs are not only a strain on the federal and state budgets, but may provide perverse incentives for work. What type of welfare reform plan would you support? What are your views on welfare reform?
Well, you know, Bill Clinton suggested here a while back, and Chuck Robb jumped up to support changing welfare as we know it. By the Taxpayers Foundation, I believe it's their estimate that the average American family contributes about $3,800 today toward welfare. Bill Clinton was right when he said he would change it as we know it. His cost would grow to about $7,000 a family, and that's changing welfare as we know it. I believe that the programs that we've got, and I talked to this very briefly in my opening remarks, have failed miserably at addressing the problems that we've got. I would suggest to you that the concept of private ownership, of incentives for work being greater than the incentives to draw a check from government, have to be adjusted, and that mindset has to apply in both houses of Congress. I do not believe that we can continue to shell out money to people and encourage the breakdown of the family by saying, we're going to pay you more and more money every time you have another child out of wedlock. And I don't believe that we're going to help our society by failing to address the issue of deadbeat dads. But I don't believe that creating government programs in our inner cities has worked over the last 30 years. The whole approach of big government to solve those problems has failed literally miserably. And that's why those indices that I articulated in my prepared remarks have become the way they are. I would suggest to you that the best solution to the welfare crisis we've got in this nation is to allow able-bodied people to work and provide incentives for private contractors and private business people like myself to hire them is the solution. Second, reducing, not increasing, the amount of money we pay for out-of-wedlock births, and encouraging the strength of the family by giving deductions for increased deductions and exemptions for family members who are dependents of a legitimate family. I believe that the programs encouraged by the government today and supported by your tax dollars and mine have created the crisis that we've got in our inner cities. And that won't change until the free enterprise system is allowed to fix it. It won't get fixed by the federal government.
Thank you, Colonel. While health care seems to have been at least temporarily put on the legislative back burner, it is likely to surface again in the near future. What kind of health care reform, if any, do you support?
Well, the Clinton proposals, and again supported by Chuck Robb, would have cost us billions of dollars for a government-run medical care system. We have today the finest doctors, nurses, hospitals, technology, and medicines on the planet. We have problems of insurance accessibility, affordability, and portability. I believe that we can do things incrementally to solve those problems without wrecking the finest medicine on this globe. I would suggest to you that giving incentives for people to be able to deduct from their income and take and set aside, call it a medical IRA or a medical savings plan, are the kinds of things that will encourage people to participate in the process. But we've gotten to the point in America where we believe that the federal government's going to solve every problem. Then what we're going to do is break the bank, and our children are never going to dig out from the mountain of debt that they've got. A government-run program similar to what was being advocated by my opponent and by the administration is not the answer. But the incremental fixes with tort reform and a medical savings plan that allows you to take before tax dollars and put it into insurance, and insurance reform which allows people to reach out in small companies like my own, where my insurance cost for my employees has grown from about 2% to over 4% as a consequence of not being able to increase and broaden the policyholders because I can't reach out across the West Virginia border or North Carolina or Maryland. That's got to change. And we've got to do things that allow insurance companies to establish a tier of rates so that everyone has access to medical insurance. There's no one being denied access to medical care. What we're talking about is insurance reform and tort reform and the kinds of things that will allow people to have an incentive to get that insurance, or at least set aside savings that will provide for their medical needs.
Thank you, Colonel. The next question is, you took an oath to support and defend the Constitution of the United States against all enemies, foreign and domestic. Yet you admitted lying to our elected Congress. Why should I support a person who admits not being true to his sacred oath?
Well, in my 22 years of service as a U.S. Marine, I fully abided by that oath. I was involved over the course of my 5.5-year assignment at the White House for about 15 months in a very controversial undertaking. Support for a freedom fighter army in Nicaragua that our government had sent in the field, and the rescue of American hostages who in some cases were tortured to death in Beirut, Lebanon. I undertook those initiatives at the direction of my superiors. I carried out the instructions that I was given, and in doing so, put at risk what had been a very successful career, the safety of my family, and my own life. And I did it not out of any motive of personal gratification or pleasure. I did it to save the lives of other people. Everyone involved in that endeavor, from the President of the United States down to the lowest ranking lieutenant colonel, was engaged in that effort to save lives. And in the televised hearings of 1987, I acknowledged that a year prior, in an informal off-the-record meeting in the White House Situation Room, I had not fully given them all of the information that they wanted. I was duly charged, and the special prosecutor took me to trial on it. The jury on that charge found me not guilty. The press has convicted me of it. And I would submit to you that that endeavor, controversial as it was carried out by flawed mere mortals, certainly not without mistakes, but that the mistakes we made, myself included, were made to save the lives of other people. Thank you.
Colonel, in a speech you gave to the Dahlgren Volunteer Firehouse in early September, you called for Virginia to be a leader in returning America to Christian values. I was at that rally. Can you defend your comment?
Well, I believe what I said, as I have consistently said, the Judeo-Christian values on which this country was founded. I have steadfastly tried to adhere to that kind of language because not only do I believe it to be correct, I believe it in my heart. I believe that this country, founded on those values, has decided that no longer are those values to be adhered to, that big government is to be the solution to all of our problems. I, for one, do not believe that government can solve every problem in our society, that the cost we bear for trying to do that has become so immense that our children are literally being sent out to sea on a fiscal Titanic, and that returning this country and encouraging people to participate in their religious heritage, whatever it may be, is something that we in elected office and I in business and secular leaders of any kind ought to be engaged in. We certainly ought not to be trying to impose our religious perspectives on others, but I do believe we ought to be encouraging people to participate in theirs.
Colonel, what are your views on campaign finance reform?
Well, I would like to see, for example, a limit on PAC contributions that would limit PACs to the same dollar amount that you or I are allowed to make. We're allowed to give $1,000 per person to a candidate running for public office. We're allowed to give a certain amount, up to $25,000 per person total for all kinds of political activities. PACs, on the other hand, can give $5,000 per election cycle. I would like to see that changed. I would like to see PACs limited to the same voice, dollar voice, if you will, that the rest of us have. I do not believe, as my opponent has obviously stood in support of the Clinton administration, that we ought to have taxpayer-funded campaigns. I well recognize, as a candidate for office, that incumbents get elected at the rate of 93%, that incumbents have the bully pulpit, they have the statewide offices, the Watts lines, the faxes, and the frank mail. And so there ought not to be limits on what can be spent in a campaign. But I think we ought to limit the involvement of PACs in this effort, because at this point my opponent has 10 PAC dollars for every 1 PAC dollar I have.
Colonel, if you had, is this on? Colonel, if you had been senator, when the Brady bill had been voted on, the crime bill, what would have been your vote and why? I would have voted against the Brady bill, and I would have voted against this crime bill. The crime bill in this case, for a whole variety of reasons. But one of the things we've apparently decided in this country is that the way to deal with the problem of crime is to take away the rights of law-abiding citizens. The reality of it is this crime bill does nothing to impose severe sanctions on those who would perpetrate a felony with a firearm. And yet we know that 93% of all firearms used in the perpetration of felonies are obtained illegally. This crime bill does very little to encourage the kinds of reforms and repairs that Governor George Allen is trying to make. It puts far too few resources into the hands of governors to build the kinds of prisons that would put behind bars those who perpetrate violent crimes. And I would submit to you that the only reason those are in the crime bill is because the Republicans made enough noise and worked hard enough to arm wrestle them to include it in the final version of the crime bill. The reality of it is that 67% of the violent crime in America is perpetrated by about 16% of the criminal population. Governor Allen has suggested that the way to deal with that is to have crime control by controlling criminals, and to give career criminals a career change and make them career inmates. That's what's going to have to happen if we're going to deal realistically with the problem of crime. Okay. Colonel, this is a multi-part question on public education. What programs of legislation, or what legislation would you propose to increase literacy, or what legislation would you support to increase literacy, decrease teen pregnancy, and raise SAT scores? In addition, what is your position with respect to vouchers for private schools?
Well, let me answer the last question first. I'm totally opposed to government vouchers. I don't believe that government vouchers that come with the tentacles of government attached to every voucher you get are what we want. I am an advocate of tuition tax credits for private, religious, or homeschooling. I believe that our public education system needs today competition in order to have it fulfill its mandate. That the increasing role of the federal government over the last 30 years has contributed to the problems we have in education today. Teen pregnancy is a wonderful illustration. It's gone up since the federal government has decided that kids need to know how to use a condom, but they can't even use a comma. And the problem we have in education today isn't because we haven't spent enough money on it. We have a higher per capita expenditure per student in America today than we've ever had before, and yet education continues to founder. I would suggest to you that what we have got to be about is encouraging parents to be involved in their education, as they most often are in religious schools and home schools and private schools, and not denying that right to only the most affluent in our society. Today, they can make those kinds of choices. In my 9 moves around the Marine Corps, Betsy and I sent our kids to public schools, base schools, private schools, religious schools, and we homeschooled. We were always able to make those choices, even as a Marine captain when I was getting what we called our monthly insult. And that was because I was still, even as a captain in the Marines, among the most affluent Americans. We were able to make those choices, but parents today cannot. That the expenditure per capita on students in public education has gone up, but grades have gone down. And I would suggest to you that education, where it is affected most by the federal involvement, and that's not in impact funds near military bases, that is the intrusion of the federal government, has left us with an educational system that guarantees a lowest common denominator outcome. And that's not what we want in our society. That public schools will not get better until there's real competition out there. And I believe my proposals will help make that happen.
Thank you, Colonel. As more and more people are becoming aware Social Security excess money is being spent on other problems, there is no trust fund. What do you believe should be done to resolve the pending financial crisis that will result from future shortfalls?
Well, you're absolutely right. There is no trust fund. 1934, when the debate was going on the floor of both houses of Congress, it was going to take 1% of the income up to a maximum of, I think, $3,400. And that was going to generate a numbered account that you could ensure that when you reached a certain age, you would have some degree of financial security in your golden years. We now know better. Chuck Robb has done nothing to stop the dipping into the trust fund and using it for all manner of purposes other than ensuring that people have that retirement income. We need to make some serious changes. The trust fund needs to be just that. It's got to stop being used for other things and other purposes. Second of all, we have got to make some dramatic changes for those who are not yet vested in that retirement, so-called retirement program, and allow people to set aside real retirement funds that are out of the hands of legislators who use it for pork projects back in their districts for their own re-elections. Those changes aren't going to happen until we get the kind of reforms that I have advocated in my 54-point plan. I do not believe that the federal government ought to be allowed to punish those people who have worked so hard and vested in the program as Chuck Robb and Bill Clinton have advocated.
Okay. Do we have time for one more question, Mr. Goldberg? One more question. Realizing that there are many Americans who are disenchanted with their government, how do you expect to make a difference?
Well, I would aim to make a difference by becoming a part of that new Republican majority to start from. I do not believe that we've got a situation in this country where the private sector is being encouraged to grow. The capital gains situation is such in this nation that it is almost impossible to leap the hurdles placed in the path of creating the capital for new venture startups. And once you've started the company, it's almost impossible to leap the obstacles of regulation. The 63,000 pages of Federal Register, which is the compilation of all rules and regulations that the federal government promulgates, is longer than it's ever been since Jimmy Carter's last year. And what we've got to be about is lightening that burden. I have asked to serve on the Commerce, Science, and Transportation Committee to bring to bear the kinds of experience that I have as a small businessman, to encourage people to start up those very risky ventures, to make the capital more available, not from government, but from the private sector. I believe that what we've got to be about in this country is trying to encourage rather than discourage private commerce in this nation. And yet the federal government is today the principal source of those revenues. We know that the Community Reinvestment Act doesn't work. We know that the Small Business Administration has not worked. We know that the way they've structured it today, starting those small businesses like mine that employ 60% of Americans who have jobs, is so very difficult that fewer and fewer are doing it. And I would suggest to you that until Northern Virginia gets its fair share of the transportation dollar, and Frank Wolf is today the only advocate out there calling for that, and I aim to join him in that cause, we will not have the kind of commerce, the kind of entrepreneurial opportunities that we're supposed to have in this country. And I aim to bring that business experience to bear sitting on that committee.
Thank you, Colonel. Before I ask Colonel North to conclude with his 3 to 5 minute conclusion, I just want to remind everybody that the other two candidates, Marshall Coleman, Senator Charles Robb, will follow each using the same pattern of introduction and question. So when Colonel North has concluded his remarks, please stay seated for the other candidates. Now, Colonel North, if you'd be kind enough to conclude.
Yes, I want to again thank you all. I was handed a note here asking me to clarify my position on public funding for abortion. Let me once again reiterate, I am totally opposed to public funding for abortion. I am prepared to make the exceptions for rape, incest, and life of the mother. I do believe that parents ought to have the right to counsel their children, and that's probably all I'm going to get to vote on that issue, and you now know how I'm going to vote. The one thing that I would urge you to consider in this election is the record of that person that I am opposed to. And if his record was so doggone good, why are our taxes so high? Why aren't our streets safer? Why don't our schools teach better? Why don't we have the resources we need to defend this nation and to keep our commitments to countries like Israel? And I would suggest to you, my friends, that we have the opportunity to change that this government can be made less intrusive, less expensive, and less of a burden on our children by getting that Republican majority in the United States Senate this year. And I would ask for your support in that endeavor and your vote on November 8th. Thank you very much.
We have as our next candidate Marshall Coleman. Mr. Coleman is a former member of the Virginia House of Delegates, a former member of the Virginia State Senate, and is former Attorney General for the state of Virginia. On behalf of the Jewish Community Council and all the co-sponsoring organizations, we welcome here today, and Mr. Coleman, if you would.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you so much. I'm delighted to be here this morning to share some thoughts with you, and I congratulate you on the turnout. It's terrific. I appreciate your interest in this race. There are 34 races for the Senate in this country this year. However, the eyes of the nation are on Virginia. This, after all, is the state of Washington, Madison, and Jefferson, and Monroe, and it's now become the land of Robb and North. And for that reason, the entire country is looking at this race. They are looking to Virginia to determine whether we have a moral compass in this state or not. And they are looking to see what kind of representation that we will send to the Senate for the next 6 years. The issues that we discussed today, and I'm looking forward to talking about them with you, relate to a number of important substantive matters about how free men and women live their lives, about how we make public policy, about how much we tax and don't tax, who receives the beneficence of the federal government, how we treat with our allies, and how the quality of our lives will change relative to the role of the government over the next 6 years. There are but 100 people in the United States Senate. It is the deliberative body of our people. And each member has as much authority and influence on public policy in this country as anybody else that there is, except the President and the Vice President. So if you look at Federalist 62, that gives the qualifications for the Senate, there really is but one major substantive qualification, and that is the question of character. And those of you who read the Washington Post this morning know that the people of Virginia barely are acquainted with the issues and the stands of the candidates that are running for the United States Senate. Their focus is on character. For absence of the ability to trust and have confidence in those who represent us in Washington, all the rest fades in importance. So I am running for the office of United States Senator because I think the people of Virginia deserve an alternative to the highly flawed and greatly baggaged candidates that our two political parties have nominated in the year 1994. There is skepticism abroad in this state and in the country about institutions, and there's skepticism about our political parties. especially this year, when the Democrats and the Republicans have so plainly failed the people of Virginia in the nominations they have made. I have met very few people in the state who say, I'm proud of the nominee of my party. He's kept the public faith. He's lived up to the trust that we expect all public officials to be obliged to. We are proud. He is an example and a role model to us and to our children. We know that we can trust him. No, that isn't what I've heard, ladies and gentlemen, and the facts are that most people either want to stop Robb or they want to stop North, and I'm here this morning to tell all of you I'm the person that can do that in both instances. I am also here to tell you that I hear a lot about strategic voting and about whether one's vote counts and what one should do to position and be on the side of the winner. But you know, I think in this election campaign, we're all going to have to look not to the polls, but to our hearts. I think we are going to have to ask Virginians to do what they believe is the right thing to do. And I think we are going to have to put partisan considerations aside and do what's right for our state and for our nation. If we elect either Robb or North to the Senate, ladies and gentlemen, we will compound the cynicism that is abroad in the nation today that is so hurtful of democratic institutions. When you see Bill Clinton go into Chicago, Illinois, and say, look, Dan Rostenkowski, he's okay. He was indicted for corruption, but he's one of ours. And when you see other politicians go into Washington, D.C. and say, look, Marion Barry, well, he's got his foibles, but he's okay. He's one of ours. And when you see politicians come into the state of Virginia and they say Robb is okay and North is okay, ladies and gentlemen, that contributes to public cynicism because none of these people are okay and the public knows it. And I am here to say they have an alternative. They don't have to be stuck with Robb or North. They can vote for Coleman on November 8th, 1994. I appreciate any time you prepare to burst into spontaneous applause. I'll stop immediately. Those of you that want to take off your Robb stickers, I don't think it'll be necessary for anybody to take off North stickers. But any of you feel that you want to... I probably shouldn't say this, but I know we're basically off the record here, so. I recall the story that someone told me one time about when you watched people, you could tell when they were going to be completely candid with you and when they weren't. They said, you know, if you watch Teddy Kennedy, when he pulls his ear, he may be getting ready to slightly mislead you. And when you watch Mario Cuomo and he pulls his nose, he may be getting ready to tell a whopper. And somebody said, well, how can you tell when Oliver North is not going to be completely candid? And they said, well, when you see his lips moving, you... They still haven't told me my time's up for the opening, so let me talk about the issues that are so carefully watched by the voters. I think during the next 6 years that people will have to vote for a candidate based on his philosophy, and we will talk about each of the issues as we go into the question period. But I think what you really need to know is what is a person's philosophy of government. So let me state mine now. My philosophy is straightforward. I believe that it is the office of government at all levels to not promise more than it can deliver, but to deliver what it can promise and does promise. I think it's the obligation of government to recognize that it cannot solve every human problem, that it ought to resist the temptation to enact a new program, entitlement, or bureaucracy to deal with every problem that we face. But when it comes to solving problems and we undertake to do something about them, we need to do it right and do it effectively. The federal government overreaches often, but when it does do things, it seems to me, in order to repose the confidence of the public, it needs to be effective and it needs to keep its promise. I think in this campaign I can reflect the philosophy of most Virginians, the philosophy that says public service is not something to denigrate, politics is not something to be ashamed of, it's more than gamesmanship, that each of us has an obligation as a citizen to be both the governor and the governed, that it's not enough simply to go to forums and to vote, but when the occasion calls upon us to take an active participation in public life. That doesn't mean that everybody should run for office. I certainly don't recommend it, at least not this year, to anyone else. But I do think when there are 6 million people in the state of Virginia who are so terribly unhappy, discontent, disappointed, and ashamed of the choices that confront the voters in November, that it's incumbent for somebody to provide an alternative, and you are looking at him. My time is up, and I'd be happy to answer your friendly questions.
Mr. Coleman, do you support the Republican Contract for America?
The Republican Contract for America that was put together on the House side has proposals in it that I agree with and some that I don't. But one of the things I think that we need to recognize is that it would be nice to have someone who goes to the Congress saying, I have a set of beliefs, but I'm not going to delegate my vote to anyone, to any party, and I'm not going to participate in political chauvinism that says, do what's best for your party. It seems to me we have to do what's best for our state and for our nation. I will look at each issue on its merits, but I'm not going to delegate my vote to anybody in Washington.
Mr. Coleman, how do you respond to the feeling that a vote for you is a wasted vote?
I'm glad you asked that. I'll tell you just a quick example. A man in Richmond who is the chairman of one of the Fortune 100 companies there, who's on my finance committee, was working, helping me raise money in a campaign in which my two opponents have thus far raised and spent the gross domestic product of Belgium seeking to be elected to the Senate. And he tried an experiment one day. He called up 35 businessmen in Richmond and asked them who they would prefer to see in the Senate, who they felt would do the best job, and not one person named a name other than my own. But they didn't all say they were going to vote for me. They had a lot of reasons. Some were going to vote for me, but some were going to do it for this strategical reason, or were going to vote for someone else for this strategical reason, or for yet another person for that tactical reason. The point is, ladies and gentlemen, in a democratic society, if people believe in someone and they vote for him, that person wins. Now, I don't think we ought to vote for someone because someone in a political party tells us we should, even though they privately say they don't like the candidate. I don't think we ought to vote on the basis of what a given political poll tells. I can remember running for governor, and as you know, I was edged out by 0.2 of a point when I ran against Doug Wilder. And I can tell you that result ruined my whole day, clearly. But the Washington Post said 10 days before the election I was 20 points behind. 20 points. The candidate for governor in Maryland, who was just nominated by the Republicans, was ahead on election day, 18 points ahead a week out, and she won. Polls are more often right than they are wrong, or more often wrong than they are right in these days of volatility. So I think what people need to recognize is that if everyone says we're going to go to the polls and vote for the person we think can do the job, then I'll win the election. If people try to play a chess game, then I think they're playing into the hands of the cynics. And I think they're playing into the hands of people that say we're all pawns. And I think as Virginians, we are being manipulated and we are being solicited for our votes for money that comes 90% out of the state by people who are not, in my opinion, deserving to be in office. So people like you who are well informed, who are knowledgeable, if you go out and tell your friends, I'm going to vote for Coleman, I think that can happen across the state. Your vote will not be wasted if you vote for me. Your vote will not be wasted if you do the right thing, and I think you're on treacherous waters if you say you're going to do the expedient thing, and even if you're going to watch the polls. They may or may not be accurate. In a democracy, we decide on Election Day. So, you heard it here first. Your vote isn't going to be wasted if you vote for me.
Mr. Coleman, let's go to foreign policy. What type of foreign policy do you believe the U.S. should adopt in the post-Cold War era? And more specifically, under what circumstances and in what form do you believe the United States should use military power as a tool of foreign policy?
Okay, let me start by saying I forgot to say one other thing. I haven't begun to advertise on TV, ladies and gentlemen. The polls won't be affected till you see me on TV, and I've started this week. On foreign policy, it strikes me that a man whose $1,000 check I was grateful to receive, Colin Powell, who along with John Warner and Linwood Holton have put political expediency behind in favor of principle, had the best formulation of what, for the second part of the question, I think the right answer is. That we ought in foreign policy to determine, first of all, whether a target of our military response is a threat to our national security. Does it somehow affect us here or our allies, or does it stand between us and some natural resource that we need? And secondly, we ought to determine whether the American people support it. And thirdly, we ought to determine whether or not there is an exit strategy. Unhappily, there are over 100 countries in the world that the Freedom House designates as being either partly free or not free. We cannot begin to force democracy down the throats of all of those countries. We don't have the resources or the capacity. That is why I oppose the invasion of Haiti. And I believe very strongly that we as a superpower now are at the pinnacle of our prestige and authority and power in the world. That cannot be wasted or frittered away on a sea of inconstancy and indecision. I think we have to be strong in the maintenance of our alliance in the Middle East with the State of Israel. I think we very much have to promote the peace process. We have to be vigilant when it comes to respect to Iraq. But I think we very much need to know that when we put our resources into play, we have a program and a strategy that advances the national interest, that we have the ability to rally the support of the American people, and that we have the knowledge and the game plan to make an exit in a reasonable period of time. Foreign policy now is difficult, and I understand that Bill Clinton, as any modern president, is having a great deal of trouble with it. But the greatest problem that I see is the failure of us to keep our word, and the fact that people do not believe necessarily when we say this is our policy, it is our policy. So we need to be muscular, we need to be constant, but most of all we have to have a strategy that the public understands and that the public supports.
Thank you, Mr. Coleman. Before we leave the realm of foreign policy, this is a multi-part question involving the Middle East. First of all, what are your views on the Middle East? Do you support the $3 billion of earmarked aid for Israel, and would you oppose any amendments to cut that aid? Will you vote for the final passage of FY96 Foreign Aid Conference Report, the Foreign Aid Conference Report? And what is your position with respect to the status of Jerusalem?
Well, I very much am in favor of maintaining that foreign aid. It's probably some of the best investment that we make. I think we have a commitment to it. The Camp David process resulted in a commitment that we made both to Israel and to Egypt that I think should be supported. We have not had a more constant ally in the history of modern alliances than we have had with Israel. And I think we have a moral and a political commitment that we need to keep. I would favor the maintenance of that foreign aid in the future. I would maintain support for Jerusalem as the capital of Israel, and I would very much pledge that if I am elected to the United States Senate, that I will not bake a cake and take it to the Iranians.
Thank you, Mr. Coleman. The next, let's go to the issue of crime. This question reads, crime in Northern Virginia is rising, including random drive-by shootings and armed robberies. The quality of life in public schools has changed, with gangs, increased drug and alcohol abuse. What are you ready to do to help solve these problems?
Yes, well, crime is an overarching issue to the people of Virginia. I think those of you that know me recognize that I alone of the candidates have had experience in managing or helping to manage the criminal justice system. I'm not saying that my opponents have not had some experience in the criminal courts, but it's been different from my own. But I do think it's vitally important that we have someone in the Senate for the next 6 years who has credibility on this issue. And let me say what I think is at the heart of the issue of crime. That, again, is a question of trust and confidence in the system. One of the reasons that I pushed hard for uniform sentencing or truth in sentencing as Attorney General, and one of the reasons I was disappointed that Chuck Robb opposed it at every turn and it was not adopted here in Virginia, is for this very simple reason. The criminal law needs to keep its promise. And if the criminal justice system says that someone is going to get 10 years, ladies and gentlemen, it contributes to disrespect for the law when in fact that is not what the criminal law really does. I think we should say what we mean and mean what we say. So I have said for years that I believe the #1 deterrent for violent and dangerous crime in Virginia is for us to send a signal that is plain and unmistakable. That if someone commits a violent or serious crime in Virginia, that person, upon conviction, goes to jail and then to prison, and that he stays there and serves his full term with no early release or easy parole. Why is that important? The small group of career criminals, and let's face facts, most poor people don't commit crimes. Most people don't commit crimes. There is a small band of various dangerous marauders abroad in our state today that are committing the majority of crimes of which we fear. And what we need to do is signal that community that something will in fact happen to them if they violate the law. So that means swift and certain punishment. It means recognition of the fact that many Virginians now do not believe the criminal justice system protects the innocent. And I can tell you that the people who commit these crimes know very much what will happen to them in that specific community before that judge and before juries. We have to change the culture so that the criminal justice system begins to live up to its promise. That doesn't mean everybody has to get a 40-year sentence, but it means if we tell someone we're going to do something to them, we do it and we mean it. Now, 95% of the crimes in the country and in this state are the province of state and local government, local prosecutors, and state law. But the federal government has a role to play as well, as a facilitator, as a supporter, as a joint partner, as someone who can provide the opportunity for the state to do a better job and can insist that the federal system does a better job. I hope, if elected, to be able to serve on the Judiciary Committee, where I will propose some substantive changes in the criminal justice system that I think will very much benefit Virginia and do something about the epidemic of gun crimes that we need to stop.
Thank you. Before we leave the issue of crime, Mr. Coleman, would you please share your opinion concerning the death penalty and the Brady bill?
Let me first say on the death penalty that I think it is a very important moral decision for a society to make, because by imposing the death penalty, we express our moral outrage at the crime committed. It was once said, if you could demonstrate beyond peradventure of doubt, if you gave someone 10 days in jail that committed murder, he would never do it again, society would not tolerate that, because we need proportionality. To me, there are certain offenses for which the death penalty is the only sanction that ultimately should be imposed. And let me say that as someone who managed all of the death penalty cases on behalf of the people of Virginia as the Attorney General. You may know that procedural due process is exceedingly important in death penalty cases if we are constitutionally to enforce the law. And so there is a whole series of appeal appeals that go forward, and we handled all of those and won all of the cases. But let me just tell you the first case I got. The first case I got involved the crime of abusing an older woman and a young girl who was the granddaughter, and then beating them up and nailing the grandmother to a chair and burning the house down. Now, when I read the facts of that case, I thought, I'll never hear of a more heinous offense. And we took it to the Supreme Court and we won. But the next case I got was even worse. So that it strikes me that what we have to reserve for ourselves is to express the moral outrage of the community when someone commits a capital offense, and to impose the death penalty after a fair procedure is followed. What has gone wrong, I think, with the system is the connection between the crime and the guilt, and the punishment and the execution is so attenuated that the death penalty has lost much of its force for people. That is why I think we can very much improve the process by which a person's appeal is heard, so that there is at some point an end to the process. The first case I took to the United States Supreme Court involved a murder case that occurred 8 years before. No one was talking about guilt or innocence. No one denied, but this particular defendant killed this particular victim. That wasn't the issue. The issue was, in a collateral attack on an appeal, what is the burden of proof that has to be borne by the state? Is it a preponderance of the evidence, or is it proof beyond a reasonable doubt? This was such a technical point, yet we were arguing it years later before the punishment could ever be imposed for the defendant. I think we need to improve the system. I think we need to maintain capital punishment. It has to be reserved only for those very serious offenses. But I think we have to let the public know there is a connection between committing a vile, horrible, heinous, savage crime and the punishment that follows.
Thank you, Mr. Coleman. If I might just drag you back to foreign policy for one more matter. It appears from my notes that the question of what your position is as respect to the status of Jerusalem was not fully addressed. Could you respond to your views on the status of Jerusalem?
Well, my view is I support the position with respect to Jerusalem as being the rightful center of government and the province of the State of Israel.
To go to the issue of a woman's right to choose.
They didn't hear you, in fact.
The question is, what is your true stand on abortion? In 3 different elections, you have taken 3 different stands. What is your stand in this election? Why did you change your opinion on abortion? And finally, do you support federal aid for abortion on demand? Please explain.
Would the person that asked that question identify himself? My position on abortion has been constant in terms of my own views, my personal views, which is that I am opposed to abortion, and I would very much hope that we could have alternatives to abortion, and I would encourage that in the communities in which we live and within private institutions and families and on a personal basis. But I have changed my view with respect to what the public policy on that should be. This is a very tough, difficult issue. The people who argue and urge different points of view both do it on the basis of moral principles. But after consideration and much debate, it's my view that if I am elected to the Senate, and if the people in their wisdom see fit to send me there, that I would not seek to change the laws on abortion. At the same time, while I would not vote to change the law to outlaw abortion, I would not vote to subsidize or encourage abortion, because I do believe that spending taxpayers' money on encouraging that is something that should not be advanced. And when I go to Washington, I will seek to represent the whole state of Virginia. Those are my views that I said at the very beginning of this campaign I would take to the Senate if elected.
Thank you. Mr. Coleman, if you are elected, what 2 or 3 bills do you plan to introduce almost immediately upon taking office that demonstrates how you differ from Senator Robb?
Well, the first thing I would try to do if elected to the Senate is that I would introduce legislation, which I've committed early in this campaign, to effect what's called the exclusionary rule. This is a technical point, but it is a point that I think is very important, because it is my view that the public is tired of seeing people who have committed serious crimes out abroad off on technicalities. And there are people that we can all name that we may have even heard from this morning that are out on technicalities. And here's the reason I think that. Cannot pretend to be the greatest student of constitutional law. That's not my specialty, but I've spent a lot of time arguing cases of constitutional dimension, and have spent a tremendous amount of time with the exclusionary rule. It's a judge-made rule. It's not of constitutional dimension. There are ways that we can contract it, and the reason we ought to do so is we can still protect against unreasonable searches, illegal entries, and all the rest, but we don't have to let somebody out on the street because the magistrate signed the wrong piece of paper. I just don't think that makes sense, and think it ought to be changed. Secondly, I believe that, unlike my opponent, Chuck Robb, I think we ought to change the tax code in the three respects that I will now mention. The first is he was the deciding vote that imposed the greatest tax increase in the history of the country in 1993, and made it apply retroactively. I don't think that's fair. I would change that. Secondly, I hope all of you would agree with me, whether Republicans, Democrats, or Independents, that when this country has really undertaken to affect the capital gains rate, it has been a spur to the economy. We've helped get the country moving again, whether under Jack Kennedy or Ronald Reagan, because the capital gains tax rests very heavily on capital formation and on the capacity of our people to create new jobs. In the 1980s, revenues went up 50% based on changes in the tax code, and I believe that when Japan and Germany have almost none or a very small capital gains tax, there is a lesson there. It doesn't just affect the wealthy. It affects anyone who has a stock or a land or house or an item they want to sell, and they don't want to be taxed on the inflationary increase in value that's occurred, and on a piece of property for which they have in effect already been taxed on. I think it would be a tonic for the economy. Secondly, I think that with the revenue that we can gain from that, we ought to have the kind of tax relief for the middle class that President Clinton talked about. And I would work to design that, because for this reason, the average family of four today is spending 40% of its income on taxes, federal, state, and local. Now, Oliver Wendell Holmes said taxes are the price that we pay for civilization. And I agree with him, but it seems to me the price has gotten so high today that it threatens to undermine our advancing standard of living. And it should be incumbent on the next senator to work hard to take a look at what I think Jimmy Carter was right in calling the great American disgrace, our tax code. It needs changing, and I would seek to change it if elected to the Senate.
Thank you, Mr. Coleman. Before going to the summation, there has been a flurry of requests that you return to the subject of the Brady bill. Oh, Brady bill. To be more specific in your response.
I'm sorry, I think I forgot the Brady bill. I would have supported the Brady bill, and I will tell you this very quickly about the whole issue of gun control, because I think it's important for you to know it. On the Brady bill, we do have the instant records check here in Virginia, which I think gives us an exemption from the Brady bill, and I think is a very good idea. I don't think we want guns in the hands of criminals and people who have been convicted of felonies. I also think that it's very important for us to recognize that no one can carry a machine gun or a bazooka, and if there can be identified to me further guns that have the purpose only of killing people, I don't see that we should make those legal. That doesn't mean I'm against people having guns for self-protection or for hunting, but I don't think guns designed simply for killing people should be. But a final word on gun control, because I think this gets confused in the fog of rhetoric that we hear coming out of Washington. The Washington Post said, even if we pass the assault weapons ban, it probably won't have much effect on crime. And I agree, because there are tons of guns out there now. There are probably 200 million guns abroad, and we can't possibly begin to confiscate those. But here's what we could do, and I would make an amendment to the crime bill if elected. What we could do is to say we favor community policing in high crime areas. So that if police go into the, and we know what they are in Virginia, into the high crime areas and simply enforce the law, the traffic laws and other infractions, for every person or car they stop for a legal purpose in a high crime area, they confiscate one gun and they legally confiscate it. Because the person's on parole, he's on probation, he's out on bail, he's not of good moral character and shouldn't be allowed to carry a gun according to the laws of the state. If we would begin to get those guns out of the hands of criminals, we'd send a signal very similar to what we did just a few years ago. When I was a kid growing up in Virginia, if someone got charged with driving under the influence, the first thing he said was, let's get a jury, because a jury will say, there but for the grace of God go I, and let the person off. Mothers Against Drunk Driving and other groups changed the public opinion about that, so that now it is perfectly unacceptable for people to drive drunk. That doesn't mean they don't still do it. If we could make it perfectly unacceptable for people to go out at night with guns in their hand and mischief in their hearts, we could send a signal to the people in the inner crime areas, wherever they might be, that we will not tolerate that conduct. And if we got those guns out of the hands of criminals, we would do more to affect the rising epidemic of gun crime than any single law we could ever pass in Washington.
Do we have time for one more question? No, we're out of time. All right. Mr. Coleman, would you be kind enough to conclude your remarks, please?
Thank you very much, all of you, those who have been responsive to my comments, who feel that I've made a point, who recognize that this is a year to do the right thing, and that we can win this campaign for Virginia, and that we will no longer have to be held up to ridicule or be a topic of the late night shows on TV for the next 6 years. If you feel that you want to vote for me, no matter what anyone tells you to do, then please vote on Election Day for Marshall Coleman. If, on the other hand, I've said something that offends, or you don't agree with me and don't want to support me, go fishing on Election Day. But in all soberness, let me say to you, my fellow Virginians, that in a few weeks, you will select the man who will stand for Virginia in the Senate until the year 2001. Senator Robb has said of himself, not everyone can be a leader. I believe Virginia wants a senator who will be a leader, whose voice will be heard in the halls of Congress. Colonel North has said that he won't have to get along with fellow senators. I believe Virginians want a senator who will represent Virginia with pride but without arrogance, who will uphold our values with fervor, but will not be carried away by renegade and self-aggrandizing zeal. Oliver North has said that Chuck Robb lacks the moral force to be a senator. Chuck Robb has questioned Oliver North's character. Ladies and gentlemen, they are both right. But the real issue is that these two men, through their conduct, while they enjoyed the special trust of public office, have shown that they are lacking in respect for the rule of law and lacking in respect for the people who place their trust in them. Virginians deserve better. It is time we in Virginia reset our moral compass. It is time that we took a long, hard look at the qualities we deserve in our public officials and in the message that we want to send to the rest of the nation. By demanding truthfulness, lawfulness, and dignity from our elected officials above all, we can set an example for the whole country at a time when all are questioning the fraying of our moral and our cultural fabric. As your senator, I will work hard to earn your trust and your respect. I will work hard for you. I will not embarrass you. I will be your voice and your vote. Give me your hand, your heart, and your vote. Thank you very much.
It is now my great pleasure to introduce to you Senator Charles Robb. Senator Robb is a former Marine, a former governor of the state of Virginia, and presently the incumbent United States Senator from Virginia, Senator Charles Robb.
Thank you, Peter. Good morning. I'm delighted to be with you. I just inquired if anyone had had a break, if you have been here since 9 o'clock this morning without an opportunity for any kind of chance to just get up and stretch or whatever. And he said, no, this is the hardcore that are here this morning, so I'm delighted to be able to join you. I thank you for giving all of us an opportunity to say a few words that I hope will be meaningful and important in making what I believe is a very important choice that all of you, all of us, are going to be called upon to make within just over 4 weeks. First of all, let me say that I'm delighted to see that this facility is finished. The last couple times I was here, I saw it in various stages of construction. I'm pleased to see, although this looks like it's a temporary flooring of some kind that is on the gymnasium floor. I'm delighted to be here, and I'm delighted to see this progress. Let me say that Saddam Hussein underscored for all of us the kinds of concerns that we have to have about foreign policy, defense policy, and reminded us that the world remains a very dangerous place. We have had significant progress in some areas in the Middle East, and every time we think that we are making progress, someone comes along or someone fails to follow through on one of the promises, implicit or explicit, that they have made, and we are reminded that we cannot take anything for granted, including the peace process or anyone's adherence to the Declaration of Principles or even some of the earlier agreements. I think, however, that there is reason for optimism, particularly with respect to what Morocco and Tunisia have done recently in that arena. There is reason for at least muted optimism with respect to what the GCC states have done. Finally, 3 years after we saved them from the fate that awaited them if they had been left to the tender mercies of Saddam Hussein after he invaded Kuwait, but nonetheless, at least it is a step in the right direction, although simply taking the blacklist down without actually ending the boycott or the embargo is a very modest step. Simply placing official representatives, as Tunisia and Morocco have done, is a very modest step. But things do continue to move in the right direction. And yet we understand perhaps better today than we might have a week ago that there are very real dangers to peace in the Middle East. We are reminded, and I will tell you that I chair the East Asia Pacific Committee of the Foreign Relations Committee, and I have long been very concerned and worried about what North Korea was doing, not just in terms of the destabilization that was taking place in the immediate vicinity with South Korea, Japan, and China, but more importantly, their export of weapons of mass destruction and terrorism. And the very fact that Syria now has the Scud-C missile that can target any place in Israel, the fact that Iraq continues to resist pressure to dismantle its 200 to 300 missiles, the fact that Iran now has the Rodong missile, which is capable of targeting Israel in that particular area, and the fact that even Libya is looking for the surface-to-surface chemical weapons that can create continuing destabilization and instability in the area ought to give all of us cause for some concern. The very fact that Saddam Hussein has moved his divisions toward the border with Kuwait gives everyone who might have thought that everything is in good shape in the Middle East pause to think again, because we know that that has not always been a rational response, nor have the actions that Saddam Hussein has taken or others in support of his actions been consistent with the long-term objectives that we have in the Middle East. With that, and with the possibility of an actual agreement being signed in the near term between Israel and Jordan, and with progress being made on the Syrian front with respect to the Golan, I will be happy to take whatever questions might exist in that area. And I'd obviously like very much to talk about a whole variety of things that, that relate to the domestic agenda and some of my own priorities here in the United States. But because you have probably been listening longer than you have been had planned to when you first came in, I would be very pleased to respond to questions from the audience. And Peter, if you're going to read the questions or identify members of the center who would like to ask those questions, I would be pleased to take them.
Okay, let's begin with the first question. Lie the fact that so much discussion has begun on foreign policy. Senator, do you support the current aid that is earmarked for Israel? Would you oppose any amendments to cut that aid? Will you vote for the final passage of the FY96 Foreign Aid Conference report? And finally, what is your position with respect to the future status of Jerusalem?
Yes, 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 and Jerusalem is the capital of Israel. Let me tell you that that's coming from a man who is not known for succinctness in giving answers, and as much as I would like to be able to continue to respond with brief, succinct answers, I'm afraid that my reputation is to the contrary, but I thank you for at least some very specific questions.
Senator Robb, what have you done to reduce the national debt? What entitlement programs can be curtailed? Please be specific.
All right. How much time do we have to answer this question? It's a serious, let me say, it is a serious and a very important question, because if we're not serious about addressing the national debt and the deficit which each year adds to the national debt, most of the other questions become much more difficult to solve or resolve, no question about it. The first thing, and probably the most important thing that I have done with respect to the national debt and annual deficits, number one, is to indicate early on in my Senate career that I would no longer support the collusion that I saw, at least, between the executive and legislative branches with respect to the numbers were used in the budgeting process, and I made it clear that I would not continue to accept the executive branch projections where all revenues were looked upon as very robust through rose-colored glasses, and all expenses were looked at in just the opposite light in the same economy, which is not going to happen. So we ended up with a budget summit, which was not my particular plan to resolve it, but at least we began to focus very seriously on debt and on the deficit. More recently, I supported a deficit reduction package that was proposed by the President that at the first estimate was believed to reduce the deficit with a combination of spending restraint and revenue increases of about $500 billion. That has since been revised upward to some $692 billion. But it is by any measure the first and most important contribution to long-term deficit reduction that we have taken in a very long period of time. Is it enough? No. Is it a very good principled first step forward? Yes. Without it, there was no other plan that was suggested that would have matched that particular program in terms of deficit reduction. It did make some very difficult and tough choices. It caused people to have to think about what our priorities are and should be, and it acknowledged that we cannot simply say yes to everybody about every spending program they like and simply punt when it comes time to actually find the resources to pay for it. The only thing that happens when we do that is continue to pass on the debt to succeeding generations, and if the interest rates were to spike up significantly in a relatively short period of time, I don't believe the country is in a position to respond to it. I don't think most of us are prepared for it. That requires that everything be on the table, to include entitlements. I have since proposed a package with a number of other senators that had 56 additional line items, but the big cuts come from entitlements. If we're not prepared to make difficult choices to restrain the exponential growth that continues in that area, and then when we're asked how we're going to pay for it, we talk about some trivial response or suggest that we'll do it with tax cuts, which obviously is politically popular. It doesn't solve the problem. We're never going to get there. I'm going to continue to propose additional spending cuts and put everything in entitlements on the table so that we can at least begin to make realistic assumptions. If we can't do it on the expenditure side, i.e. if we can't cut enough in spending and say we're for a balanced budget, we've got to do it on the revenue side, and we can't continue to ask the American people to believe otherwise because we're not being honest.
Thank you, Senator. Senator, you have been criticized for not introducing legislation in the Senate. If you are reelected, what 2 or 3 pieces of legislation will you introduce that will improve or change things?
Oh, let me say that I don't know that the introduction of legislation is an appropriate criteria for legislative or public policy effectiveness. I think most of the individuals, certainly in an audience that is as informed as this one, would understand that major legislation is introduced by the committee chairs and sometimes with the ranking members. I have co-sponsored a lot of legislation. I have introduced a number of individual pieces of legislation and or amendments, and some of the legislation has been incorporated into amendments. And the truth of the matter is I have a pretty good batting record for actually getting the legislation that I introduce passed. We have some legislation that was either caught up in bills that were killed in the last weeks of the 103rd Congress, or others that were simply never ripe for final disposition that I will continue to work on. They're not all that exciting. I don't happen to chair the major committees where you would get the kind of landmark legislation introduced, but I have worked very hard on a number of pieces of legislation. I'd be happy to talk about any of those specifically if there are questions on them, but I guess I would challenge the premise that simply introducing legislation is even an appropriate criterion for establishing effectiveness of someone in elective office. If you introduce legislation that is important, that works, and it ultimately gets passed, then it is. But if you introduce legislation that just clutters up the congressional record or makes for press releases or whatever, I would take a very different view.
Senator, how do you respond to Marshall Coleman's and Oliver North's attacks on your character?
Well, first of all, let me say that I think that character is very important. I have never taken a contrary position. I think that anyone who seeks to serve in public office or public life ought to demonstrate by their commitment over a long period of time that they have the character, because if you can't get by that threshold question, it's very difficult to know whether you can believe them when they talk about things they're going to do or whether they're going to stick with positions that they have articulated during the course of a campaign. So you have to know that there is some commitment that has been demonstrated over a period of time to telling the truth, to following through, to standing up and being counted on occasion when it may not be politically popular to do so, to telling people what they need to hear, not just what they want to hear, to answering some of the tough questions that come up from time to time during the course of any real policy debate, and not always ducking when it comes time to make choices, which in effect is what we're all called upon to do. So I would say that character is indeed important. Character is made up of a number of different elements in each and every one of us, and that anyone, before they vote for an individual, ought to take a look at that individual's character as it's defined objectively, and not let somebody else attempt to suggest that it is other than what it is based on their own desire to replace them.
There is a follow-up question that I've been asked to ask, and that is specifically, and we're going back to an earlier question, which entitlements are you prepared to cut?
Well, I have indicated in the past entitlements are responsible for over 50% of our budget. Let me just explain something, and I'll come right to that, because I'm saying I'll put them all on the line. I've made that very clear. I have voted to restrain growth in all of the entitlements, to include those that are considered the most politically sensitive. We had in the bill that we passed not too long ago, as you know, some restraint even in Social Security, which is looked upon as the holiest of holies, if I may use that particular terminology. If we're not prepared to tell people that we will put everything on the table, and you must assume that everything is on the table, we end up doing nothing and putting at risk the most vulnerable. So yes, all of the elements, everything that constitutes entitlement, and the biggest are the most controversial. Anybody who seeks to touch Social Security, Medicaid, Medicare can be demagogued against very easily. But you ought to ask those individuals what they're going to do if they're not willing to put those on the table. Because if you exclude defense spending, which has now been cut to the very barest minimum, I think that we can cut defense spending. If you exclude entitlements, and if you exclude interest on the national debt, you've only got about 13+% of the budget left. And we have taken almost all of the cuts in recent years out of that 13%. I am prepared to place additional restraint in some of those areas, and much of the proposal for $94 billion worth of additional cuts that a number of us on a bipartisan basis submitted had a disproportionate share, again focused on that small 13% or so of the budget. But if you're going to solve the problem, you have to take on entitlements, and you have to be able to put every entitlement on the table. I may not have conveyed my message very effectively in a debate, but I suggested that you've got to be concerned about widows and orphans. What I was trying to suggest, and I use this in shorthand when I'm talking to Senate colleagues all the time, is that if we won't make choices, if we don't have the intestinal fortitude to tell people occasionally that we're going to cut spending in programs that they like, and that we're going to increase revenues through taxation or some other form, if we don't have the intestinal fortitude to do it on the spending side, then we're going to place at risk the most vulnerable in our society, who are the widows and orphans. I may not have conveyed that message as successfully as I had hoped to at the time, but I wanted to underscore the fact that everybody always wants to talk about all of the spending we're going to give you. Me in office, and I will provide all that you've ever asked for. I simply think that that undermines the credibility of the process. It breeds cynicism in the body public and the body politic, and I think it's understandable. So if you're not willing to say yes, everything is on the table, and make some principled choices, then we're not going to solve the problem, period.
Thank you, Senator. I have two questions here on immigration that I'll combine. How would you control illegal immigration? How do you feel about giving welfare benefits to illegal immigrants?
Well, first of all, we are not giving the welfare benefits knowingly, at least to illegal immigrants, and we're not putting, and in terms of any of the proposals that are currently extant, we're not proposing to do so. There are some emergency matters that do have to be addressed, and that obviously as a compassionate society, if you have someone who is in need of immediate emergency medical attention, you can't simply cast those folks out without responding to the most urgent need. Beyond that, however, they are not included. With respect to immigration reform generally, there are needs that need to be addressed. We need to take another look at some of the things that we do with respect to border security and some of the other process matters, in addition to the formulas that we use with respect to immigrants from particular countries. There are no easy answers to the question of immigration, however, and I can assure you that this is an issue that is very easy to misunderstand and to demagogue and not very easy to solve.
Okay. If I might combine two questions on education. First, what is your position with respect to private school vouchers? Secondly, would you support legislation removing taxing educational fund bank accounts and income raised to pay for children's educations?
Let me respond to the first question, and then I may have to ask you to restate the second question. I'm not sure I understood it. With respect to the first question,
sure I did.
I have a high regard for private schools, parochial schools, and for those parents who are willing to engage in homeschooling. I don't think there's any commitment that is greater on the part of parents. I commend them for it. But I am not willing to divert necessary public resources to any private education until such time as we have fully met our responsibility to the public school system in this country.
And if I might rephrase that question, would you support legislation preventing the taxing of educational fund bank accounts?
Preventing the
If I can rephrase
taxing
that.
of educational fund bank accounts.
And income raised to pay for children's education.
I'm not certain that I understand what that question is getting at. If somebody would like to phrase that question a little differently, I don't want to give you a misleading answer, and I'm not quite sure that it sounds like a double negative, and I would prefer to have a different...
All right, let's go on to the next question then, if we can, because we're running out of time. Please state your position with respect to abortion funding and parental notification.
All right, with respect to funding of reproductive services or abortion, I have indicated that, first of all, let me say, while I have never described myself as pro-abortion, I have been unequivocally pro-choice, and if we are going to... It becomes a much more difficult question for many of our citizens, some thinking it has an economic component, and it really doesn't, because the actual dollars that we're talking about in the overall scheme of things are de minimis when it comes to whether or not you will provide taxpayer dollars, is the way it's normally stated, so that you feel that you can have it both ways, because the vast majority of our citizens feel, I think pretty much like I do, that while we're not advocating abortion, we want to leave that choice to the individual, but we feel somehow we can pull back a little bit by saying, but we won't allow any public funding for it. I understand that that makes that flips in terms of public support for the issue, but if you're going to be principled about it, and if most private health plans provide coverage for reproductive services, what in effect you're saying is that I will allow public funds to be spent for everything but one service, and if you're poor, you can't have that service, but if you have the funds and are not required or not dependent upon other resources, sure, you can have any service that's available to you. That discriminates against precisely the group that we're trying to assist, and puts those who don't have the resources back out in the back alleys where we're trying to rescue them from. So we can't duck that question if we're trying to be serious about providing some degree of equality to all of our citizens. So I am willing to say that if a health care plan in the private sector, the government sector, or any other provides for reproductive services, and we say that we're willing to provide health care, then for those who don't have the resources, I can't make a reasonable argument that says the only health care service you can't have is the one where your choice is likely to be most difficult, and we're likely to put your own life at peril if you're placed in that very difficult situation. So I am prepared, and I have voted for just that, not only in terms of rape, incest, or gross fetal abnormality, but it seems to me that we have to be consistent, but I know that there's a great big shift in people who say, well, fine, but don't do it.
Senator Robb, what is the answer to increasing crime? More money, more punishment, or what? Your views, please.
Well, first of all, I'm not for increasing crime, so in terms of the way that one is stated, I don't want to come down on the wrong side of it. Let me say that those who believe that the best or only way to decrease crime is to increase punishment are not staring reality in the face. Yes, we have to make certain that punishment is, to the extent we can possibly do so, we have to make certain that punishment is certain and is fair and is evenly administered, and hopefully is administered as early as possible rather than after years and years of delay. And for those who pose a particular risk to society because of the violence of the crimes of which they have been convicted, it seems to me that we ought to make certain that those people are locked up for as long a period as our conscience and our system and our basic public policy will allow. But to suggest that the only way to solve the problem is to simply lock the key, throw them in jail and lock them in jail and throw away the key simply misses the point. In areas where that approach has been tried, indeed in the United States, in states where the longest penalties or the longest period of incarceration takes place, there is no reverse correlation between the amount of crime. Indeed, the contrary, regrettably, is often the case. So we need to be much more targeted in how we approach the question. We need to make certain that those who commit truly violent crimes against society are locked up and society is protected from them. But for those who are youthful, first-time, nonviolent offenders, it seems to me we need to do everything we can to find ways to divert them from the system so that they don't become career criminals, and maybe with a little discipline they get their lives straightened away. At the very least, they don't get an advanced course in crime itself. That was the basis of the federal crime bill that has been much denigrated after the fact, but was widely supported at the time. We're going to provide additional facilities to lock people up for very long periods of time for truly violent crimes against society. We're going to provide diversionary facilities with abandoned military bases and what have you to place some of those first-time offenders. And we're going to provide some prevention and treatment funds, because if we continue to ignore the root causes of crime, whether we attack them through the criminal justice system or through some other system, we're not dealing realistically with the challenge that faces this country today.
Senator Robb, health care is now on the legislative back burner. It is likely to surface again in the near future. What kind of health care reform, if any, do you support?
Well, let me say that health care is important. I have been working on health care reform for quite a number of years. Right after I left the governor's office in January of 1986, I agreed to serve on a National Leadership Commission on health care reform. We spent 2 or 3 years. I was one of the few lay people involved. There was another former governor. There were a couple of other lay people, but most of them were AMA types, hospital types, insurance types, other people who are directly involved in the day-to-day workings of the delivery of health care system in our country. We came to about the same conclusion that the Pepper Commission, the Sullivan Commission, and others came to, that if you want to bring about systemic reform, particularly if it's going to be inclusive, you're going to have to spend more money rather than less money in the near term, or you can't get it done. The plans that were proposed, including a very good faith effort on the part of the President, I was not a co-sponsor because there were a number of elements of the plan that I was not comfortable with, including what seemed to me to be an unworkable mechanism between the employer mandates, particularly as it addressed some of the small businesses, but probably necessary if we're ever going to get universal coverage. I was very much concerned about what seemed to be an unworkable bureaucracy in terms of the management and the alliances that were designed to both administer as well as to collect people together. And I was concerned about a punitive excise mechanism for the costs that could not be internally cost shifted within that particular program. Having said that, everybody agrees that we'd like to have it simpler, certainly maybe a health security card so we could walk in and have all that information. I've been working on that in a different context for years, and I hope eventually we get to that. We'd like to eliminate the pre-existing, we'd like to eliminate excluding people because of a pre-existing condition. We'd like to make sure that people don't lose their coverage or have a huge rate increase because they or a family member have an illness. We'd like to make them portable.